Hey guys, hope all is well. Today I'll be giving you a few tips on how to properly expose your footage so it looks good in the final edit. Now, before we get into how to properly expose footage, we need to gain a better understanding of the elements that exposure comprises of. In a camera, there are three components that regulate how dark or how bright your scene is. These three elements are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. They all have their uses, so that said, we'll start with aperture. In a camera lens, there are blades, and these blades open and close to let various amounts of light into the camera sensor. Aperture is measured in f-stops, or t-stops depending on if it's a cinema lens, and most lenses have manual aperture rings with numbers on them from low to high. Now, you may think a higher f-stop number means brighter exposure, but that is incorrect. It is in fact the other way around. A lower f-stop number equates to a brighter exposure, and a higher number equates to a darker exposure. Aperture also affects depth of field, or in layman's terms, how much of a scene is in focus. Due to this, aperture is usually what you want to set first when exposing for a scene, especially if you're doing a shot where you're trying to isolate a subject with a shallow depth of field. Like previously stated, f-stop numbers affect your depth of field, but in this instance, lower f-stop numbers will allow you a shallower depth of field basically, and while on the other end, higher numbers will give you a fully sharp scene. Lastly, be careful with setting your aperture too high. This can lead to diffraction within the elements of a lens, causing you to basically lose detail in your footage, and you don't want that. Moving on to shutter speed. Shutter speed is usually the second thing you want to set when exposing a scene. Shutter speed is the rate at which your camera sensor scans the scene in front of it. So for those of you who don't know, a camera sensor is comprised of millions of pixels in horizontal rows, and the way a camera takes an image is by scanning the light hitting it row by row individually. So the faster your shutter speed, the faster the sensor completes this row by row scan, thus limiting the amount of light, or the amount of time light has to be scanned by the photoreceptors on each pixel. So if that went completely over your head, then the simple explanation is the faster the shutter speed, the darker the exposure, and vice versa. I also failed to mention that shutter speed is measured in seconds or fractions of seconds. So, for example, 1/50th of a second or 10 seconds. That represents the time the camera's sensor has to completely scan the scene. Usually shutter speed in cameras range from 30 seconds to 1/8000th of a second. Now, like in photography, shutter speed affects motion in the scene. The faster the shutter speed, the more likely you are to freeze all motion in a scene. And the slower the shutter speed, the more likely you are to capture all the movement in a scene. So how does this apply to film? Well, video is just a bunch of pictures being played in succession at 24 frames per second. So setting your shutter speed correctly will determine how natural the motion blur in your scene looks. Generally, 1/50th of a second is the most natural looking to the human eye, but this number is subject to change very slightly depending on how much dynamic range is in a scene. Now lastly comes ISO. ISO is the last setting you want to adjust when exposing for a scene. Basically, all ISO does is adjust how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. So a lower ISO means less sensitivity, while a higher ISO means more sensitivity. You may think this is all fine and dandy, but there are a few drawbacks to cranking up the ISO. Usually when you crank the ISO to a higher number, you start to see more noise in the image. Basically, all noises is grain in the image. It kind of looks like pixelated sand, and it really degrades the quality of an image if not set to a proper level. So be careful with your ISO values. So now that you all are exposure triangle masterminds, we can finally move on to the most helpful tool that you can use when you don't know if you've properly exposed a scene. This magical tool is called a histogram. A histogram is basically a graph that plots all the tonal values in a scene on a little chart. Histograms are set up to have the shadow values on the left side and the highlight values on the right side. Now, the data plotted on the graph shows you where most of the tonal values in your scene lies, and the plot looks like a bunch of hills or spikes depending on how strong your tonal values are. If your spiky plot looks like it's being cut off by either side of the graph, that means you've lost detail in the shadows or the highlights. Your goal should be to get all the data in the image plotted as close to the center of the graph as possible. But if you encounter a scene that is overwhelmingly bright, try to expose to the left. This means try to get all of your hills and spikes to the left side of the graph to avoid detail loss in the highlights. If you lose detail in the highlights, there's no chance of recovering it, So if you're going to clip either side of the graph, try to stay on the left side or the shadows, because camera sensors can see a lot better in the dark than in the brightest highlights. Alright guys, that was all I have for you today. Hopefully you all know something new, and you're all exposure geniuses. So that said, I'll see you later.